Good afternoon, and welcome to the Atlantic Council for today's event on the launch of the inaugural Commercial Space Strategy. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. The release of the 2024 Commercial Space Strategy comes at a pivotal moment. The days have long passed when the U.S. government had a monopoly over the most innovative space systems, and today the Space Force can draw on solutions from a burgeoning commercial sector. Indeed, the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated just how essential commercial space systems and data can be for the U.S. government for national security purposes. These developments also bring to the fore questions of possible adversary aggression against space systems owned by U.S.-based commercial operators and how the Space Force and the nation should address that challenge. To meet this new reality, the Space Force has released its long-anticipated strategy, which outlines how the Space Force plans to incorporate commercial systems and explore partnerships with and send clear demand signals to industry collaborators. The strategy also addresses the critical questions of safeguarding space assets in conflict. But what does this really mean for the future of space security? How will the commercial space sector shape the future of U.S. Space Force and vice versa? To discuss these questions, we're very fortunate today to be joined by Deputy Chief of Space Operations, Strategy, Plans, Programs, and Requirements, Lieutenant General Sean Bratton, who will share his insights on the space strategy and the future of space security. As the Chief Strategy and Resourcing Officer, Lieutenant General Bratton has overall responsibility for the strategies, requirements, and budget of the United States Space Force. General Bratton has led a distinguished military career and has served in numerous operational and staff positions. He served as the U.S. Northern Command Director of Space Forces, commanded the 175th Cyberspace Operations Group, and served as the Deputy Director for Operations, United States Space Command. Prior to this assignment, General Bratton served as the First Commander, Space Training and Readiness Command. Lieutenant General Bratton, thank you for your leadership, and we look forward to your remarks today. Moderating today's conversation is Clementine Starling, the Director of the Forward Defense Program within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Meetings like this are central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies. The Center also honors the legacy of service of General Brent Scowcroft and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Consistent with the Scowcroft Center's mission, the Center's Forward Defense Program generates ideas and connects stakeholders in the defense ecosystem to promote an enduring military advantage for the United States, its allies, and partners. Its work identifies the defense strategies, capabilities, and resources the United States needs to deter and, if necessary, prevail in future conflict. This event is public and on the record. We encourage our audience online and in person to direct any questions to Lieutenant General Bratton using askac.org. Be sure to identify yourself and your affiliation in your questions. We'll be collecting the questions throughout the event, and Clementine will pose some of these questions to Lieutenant General Bratton. We also encourage our audience to join the conversation on X by following @ACScowcroft and using the hashtag #ForwardDefense. Thank you all again very much for joining, and now I'd like to turn to Clementine to moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, General Bratton, so much for joining us. It's fantastic to see folks in the audience, familiar faces and some new ones, and thank you to our virtual audience for tuning in online. So we have about an hour today to dig into the U.S. Space Force's commercial space strategy. So I'm going to pose some questions, moderator's privilege, but I would really like to include questions from our in-person and our virtual audience. So just to reiterate Matt's point, please pose your questions to askac.org. If you submit them there, they will come through to me here magically on the iPad, and I'll try and pose those questions throughout. Just identify yourself, your affiliation, so we know kind of who's asking the questions. But Sir, General Bratton, thank you for being here. So congratulations, first and foremost, on the release of your first ever Space Force commercial space strategy. I read through the strategy, and I think it's really well done. And really, it's a striking acknowledgement, I think, of the transition that's taken place in the space environment over the past 20 years. An increasing number of spacefaring nations, new kinds of space actors. We have a booming US and allied commercial space sector. We've got reduced cost of launch, which means increased access to space than ever before. So that creates a bunch of new opportunities, but also some potential challenges. And it certainly adds to a kind of congested and contested space environment to a degree. So to kind of kick us off, walk us through why the Space Force decided to release this strategy and how it aligns with the broader goals of the National Defense Strategy and the mission set of the US Space Force.
Clementine, thanks. First off, thanks for letting me come here. We were talking before the show, and my first time coming to the Atlantic Council and understanding the work that's done here. So thanks to you and the team for everything you do, and thanks for hosting us today. For the audience here and everybody online, thanks for taking some time to listen. It sounds like you're already expert on the commercial strategy. So with the intro, I mean, you really nailed it. We're trying to do some new things, and the environment is really changing fast. I think. And we've historically worked with commercial industries. It's not like a brand new idea to work with commercial. I think what General Saltzman really wanted from the team and that he charged my team to write this strategy for was to hold ourselves accountable on, hey, how do we think about our interaction with commercial? How do we make ourselves maybe a little uncomfortable and go into new areas where we haven't explored or we haven't partnered with commercial as much? And then how do we build on just this long history where we've worked with commercial partners in more traditional areas like satellite communications, but really write that down and then measure ourselves against it, hold ourselves accountable, get feedback maybe most importantly from outside of the department on folks on, hey, how are we doing? How can we do better? I think that's, the first step is you got to put something out there and let people, whether they like it or don't like it, actually read it and then give us some feedback. And so that was maybe the primary goal of writing something down and publishing it.
Fantastic. Well, really glad that you did. And I'm hoping today we can get some questions from the commercial space sector. I think there are some folks in the room and hopefully online. So pose your questions or maybe put some comments in, share some feedback. So I did want to talk about what's different about this approach. So General Cavelli, General Saltzman kind of say at the beginning of this strategy that it marks the Space Force's pivot to a new model. I think they literally say new model for integrating commercial space solutions with an emphasis on building hybrid space architectures that integrate DoD, commercial, and allied space systems. So what is so new about this model or way of doing business? And maybe if you could kind of reflect a little bit on, in practical terms, what kinds of different, new, or improved kind of mechanisms and approaches will the Space Force take to working with the commercial sector that is different?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there to talk about. So, historically, we have always, like I said, received commercial services, paid for commercial services in ways that we were sort of very comfortable. Satellite communications being a great example, domain awareness, but partly driven by just the rapid increase in commercial space capabilities that we see over certainly the past 10 years in even shorter time frames in some mission areas. So that increased commercial development brought new capabilities available to us. I think the reality for the Department of Defense is we think about how do we leverage commercial's ability to be more agile? How do we move out of our traditional acquisition sort of stereotypical stovepipes of slow, cumbersome acquisition projects and take advantage of this just rapidly moving commercial enterprise, and in ways where we really got to stretch ourselves. Not traditional, I'm going to lease some satellite communication bandwidth from you, but expanding that beyond just sort of services contracts. Now, at the end of the day, we partner with commercial industries. In procurement, there's lots of companies building things that then the government operates. But this is a little bit different than that model. And this goes to your point on integration of how do we not just have better contracts and take advantage of the agility aspect, but how do we work with commercial through maybe what might be a spectrum of conflict, and what does that look like, and how do we think about interoperability and integration in light of having commercial partners right there with us. And I think we've taken some steps in this area. The commercial integration cell out at Vandenberg in the operations center out there is maybe a step that now we're trying to push ourselves to go further, certainly in some of these new mission areas where traditionally we haven't talked about commercial partners and integrating commercial in this way. You know, we're really trying to push some boundaries. And I wouldn't say that we know the answers or even have a crystal clear understanding of what the end state. I think we see the possibilities there, and we want to leverage commercial to help us provide that clarity and see where we can go in some of these areas.
So to take a step back, because I want to talk a little bit about how the space environment is evolving, it also in terms from a kind of threat landscape perspective. So the ultimate goal of the strategy, as kind of written, is to create a more diverse, proliferated, resilient, and distributed space architecture. So from a kind of competition, deterrence, threat perspective, why is that so needed? And how will this strategy help the Space Force kind of with the modernization and resiliency of space architecture?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, and the strategies, I think, do a good job. Both strategies, OSD strategy and the Space Force one, of laying them out. But there's the resiliency aspect. You know, that's an attribute that we want in all the capabilities we provide. That's probably true for any organization, but we want to make sure that we have the best chance of success. We create the greatest opportunity for success in delivering a capability, whether that's, like I said, the traditional satellite communications or in some of these new areas, you know, surveillance and reconnaissance activities, Earth observation. How do we think about our reliance on commercial and integrating them as a partner in the mission space, vice just we're gonna purchase bandwidth or imagery or whatever the services contract might be, and how does that change through the spectrum of conflict? It's maybe easier to see in peacetime what that looks like. I think as you transition into higher levels of competition and conflict, you know, I think that as much as the department's uncomfortable, I'm sure there's discussions on commercial industry on what's their level of comfort, and I think we have to really have these conversations now and think about what are the mechanisms we use in times of conflict to leverage commercial, because we'll absolutely need it. We can't afford just to build everything that the Space Force wants for an objective force or for the force we need for competition and conflict. I think commercial offers so many opportunities to both in peacetime and in conflict to leverage that at what in some ways will be just cost advantage for the taxpayer and for the department, but in some ways the agility and innovation that we see, commercial's ability to really rapidly flex and change and produce, and respond. What we would say a threat, but to them maybe a changing market condition, and how we've observed that across the space enterprise in the last 5 years is really amazing to us, and we're trying to harness all that energy. Yeah.
So many threads there that I want to pick up on, and I have so many questions. So I do think what struck me was kind of the mention of kind of integrating commercial like across the competition continuum. That really stuck out to me in the document. So kind of what that really looks like in terms of engaging commercial, both from kind of space, crisis management to competition and warfare. So maybe we can come back to that. But you mentioned the Office of the Secretary of Defense's kind of commercial integration strategy. So your strategy comes on the heels of that DoD-wide strategy. How do the two documents relate?
Yeah, we worked closely with John Plum's team and the strategy department within the Space Force, and so there's a lot of synchronization there, and down to even making sure we release the documents in the right order at the right time. how we thought about the higher level guidance that we, the Space Force, were really looking for from the Secretary of Defense and from that level. And I think they address a couple broader topics. Within the Space Force, we're very focused on delivery of capabilities to the Joint Force, on protection of capabilities during time of conflict, so we can continue that delivery mechanism. I think at the Secretary of Defense level, they're focused on those same things, but there's a different understanding of it in the obligation of the service to really do that underneath the guidance of the Secretary. And so I think they're both certainly strategic level documents, but I think they nest well, and I'm really appreciative of the work that came out of the Office of Secretary of Defense, the policy team there, as they worked with us on sort of content that was going to be in our document. And I wouldn't go so far to say we colluded, to that, we're going to write about this and that, but we did meet and discuss ideas and some things that we were looking for from them, and I think they were looking for us. So there was a lot of kind of synchronization of the documents.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great to see them. They're both good reads. Just to pull the thread, I guess. So. Reading the DoD's commercial space integration strategy, it outlines 13 mission areas, right. And then it allocates those mission areas into 3 different categories. The first being government primary mission areas, like where the government will remain primarily performing those functions. I think they had combat power production, command and control, electronic warfare, and position, navigation, and timing. The second is those hybrid mission areas, where a hybrid mix of government and commercial will perform the functions. So I think they had cyberspace operations, satellite communications, and space domain awareness. And then the third, commercial primary missions, where most functions will be performed by commercial. And I think they only had space access, mobility, and logistics formally in that category. So then in the Space Force's strategy, you had 8 main mission areas highlighted. So how did you land on those 8 mission areas? How do they align with the DoD's 13? And of your 8 mission areas, do you have a prioritization, like an order in which you're prioritizing those, or is every child equal?
Yeah, it's smart because there's a background discussion on the Space Force on how we articulate the mission areas. And if you ask the budget team, which I have, they articulate them one way, and in doctrine we articulate them another way. And so there's a lot of different thoughts on what are the 13. In doctrine, it does outline the 13, and that's where OSD policy started. I think of those, we sort of took the ones that we thought we were. I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but the ones that we thought we could integrate with commercial, and the remaining ones where we did not address in our document, where they sort of called out, here's areas where we're not going to partner with you. We identified the 8 that were, I think, more willing to. I think the great discussion is, well, how, what is in the hybrid model? Well, how much are you willing to go to commercial? Is it 30% or 40% or 50%? And across the board, the answer is probably, well, we're not sure. We're if we go too far, we start to get uncomfortable on, well, that's too much reliance on commercial. And I think you wrote a paper on this last fall, that I thought was great. Just to give you props on while we're here.
I'll pay you later.
But it went, it went right at this issue on. As a military service, we have an obligation to provide for the Joint Force, to protect our spacecraft and our capabilities on orbit in the terms of space superiority. And so, but if we're really talking about interoperability and integration, we can't draw a line and say this is we're not accepting of commercial in this space. We have to find ways to bring them in, and the capabilities they have. And their ability to respond to threats, and what we've seen in current conflicts within the world is, those are capabilities that we want to have access to in conflict. So we're trying to find that balance, and I wouldn't say that we have settled on a percentage, but it's the discussion that we really want to have on how much can we bring in. More is better, I think, is what the strategy is trying to say. We want to really have a discussion with industry on, well, how does this look to industry? What's your level of comfort in bringing these capabilities in, and then committing, I think this gets to contract language and the mechanisms, but committing to providing those services during conflict. What does that look like to a commercial company? And this dialogue that we really have to start having beyond just, I have a contract for services, because interoperability and integration really, leads to sort of shoulder-to-shoulder operations where we're sharing information, we're discussing threats, we're demanding or asking, depending on the language that we agree on, for specific services at a time and place of our choosing to meet the needs of the joint force. And so, but I see that very clearly through the military lens, and I need to see better through what industry thinks of it. And that goes back to why public strategy. Well, we have to write this down and get it out there, and then really try and get some reflections and feedback and things that we won't have thought about, that commercial industry would say, hey, that sounds great from the Department of Defense, but here's what that looks like from the commercial side. So I think that goes back into the why of the document, is to really start those discussions in a more meaningful way.
So just as a kind of follow-up on those 8 mission areas, I think in the DoD-wide strategy, there's an acknowledgement that some mission areas might shift, right, from government primary to hybrid to maybe, eventually commercial primary. Right. Just as commercial capabilities mature, as military requirements evolve. So can I ask you maybe a tricky question to answer? What are the mission areas that you think are more likely to kind of eventually transition, potentially, from that government primary to hybrid? Because you mentioned that, of those 8, those are the ones that you kind of have in mind as being available already. Like, if you were to task the commercial sector to double down in a certain area, what kinds of capabilities would you be most interested in seeing commercial mature?
That's a great question. I think the answer is always sort of, where are we willing to put our money? That's, in one way, that's a metric that we'll have to watch closely. I think domain aware, communications, clearly we have gone there in the past, we'll continue to go there. I think domain awareness in recent years is really on the uptick, and we are relying more and more, and we're more and more comfortable relying on commercial for looking into the space domain, helping us keep track of objects out there, providing data, and sharing data on what's happening in the domain. And so I think that, that's sort of, maybe we're already there. I think there'll be continued growth in that area. I think that when you step beyond those and the others that enlisted, when you start talking about navigation and timing, when you start talking about environmental monitoring, I would say we're probably there in Earth observation and different especially electro-optical observation of the Earth. I think we're already there, but some of these other areas, I think we're trying to understand of what's possible from commercial, and what makes a good business case for them, for any particular company. And those are discussions we're trying to have. I smiled in the OSD document where they talk about mobility and logistics, because I think there's an argument that's probably, out of all of them, that's our least mature area. Like, we talk about space refueling, but we don't really know, like, what's the case for military utility. We're having a lot of discussion from U.S. Space Command on dynamic space operations and how do we think about that. And so it's one area when we went full commercial, it's like in an area that is very immature for the Department of Defense, and we're really saying, commercial lead us to, we're not sure what to make of this. We think there's something here. Really help us figuring it out. We know what we need for navigation and timing, and a very mature area, but we hold maybe a little more tightly to that one. So it maybe is an example of, hey, we're taking some risk here, but also we really want to not have to figure this out on our own. We want to partner and leverage commercial, and that drifts a little bit into how we think about futures and the stand-up of Space Force Futures Command, and how we are trying to get our eyes further down the road, and perhaps commercial takes us there. Mobility and logistics being one area where we're going to see if they can really help us figure it out.
Right.
Yeah.
So really, you've touched on this when you're talking about kind of comfort levels, and I do want to talk about, like, to really embrace this strategy and have commercial supplement or supplant existing government capabilities. it really requires a bit of a mindset shift towards really considering, what the government must build itself for itself versus buy from commercial sector versus like really integrating with the commercial sector, not just kind of contracting out services. So kind of what are your thoughts on this kind of cultural shift that really needs to take place in order to embrace the strategy and really consider commercial capabilities first in some areas? And then you've talked about kind of the comfort level. Like, what are the risk considerations that go into your thinking around potential over-reliance on the commercial space sector? Like, how do you measure that risk?
We have this discussion a lot, especially in relation to the budget and how we think about when we're building a budget for any given year. I mean, the true proof is when we don't spend money to develop a capability and we acknowledge we're going to rely on commercial for that, and that makes people very uncomfortable. But we rely on commercial in every domain, in every mission area. So I'm not sure why it makes people so uncomfortable, other than in space these things have only perhaps been done by the Department of Defense for the Joint Force. And so I think there's a little bit of soul searching on, well, let's understand why this makes us uncomfortable. It really comes down to being able to measure the risk. If we rely 100% on commercial for any capability, how do we ensure that capability is going to be there when we need it, specifically, in conflict? And there are areas where we would be unwilling to take that risk, or just, sort of inherently military things that we would keep in the department. But there's a lot of areas that span both ways. Domain awareness being a great example on, hey, we want to keep track of an adversary on orbit all the time, understand what's going on there. If it's a capability that's threatening to us that makes the joint commanders uncomfortable, how do we feel about relying on a commercial company to keep track of that threat object? Would we do that? How do we feel about that in the air domain or land domain? And there are lessons to learn from how they've drawn this line. And certainly the Air Force and Navy contract out all sorts of things to commercial, and there's a long history there. I think in these areas it's just new to us, so we're learning, and I think commercial is going to help us get more comfortable. And there are many examples we can point to today where we have a great association with the commercial industry, and they've delivered for us every time. But I think it's a two-way conversation. We got to understand what it looks like to the commercial industry as well. What makes them uncomfortable, and then ultimately, contractual language and vehicles come into how do you actually implement that in a contract.
Right. So on that two-way conversation, I do want to talk about the risk to the commercial sector, right? Because we talked about the competition continuum. Ukraine has shown the benefits of proliferated commercial satellite constellations. SpaceX, the Starlink constellations played a really imperative role in supporting Ukraine. But Russia has threatened attacks on commercial space assets and services, which exposes a challenge, right? As governments increasingly rely on commercial assets during competition and conflict, like who, what, when, how do we protect those commercial assets? Should commercial assets be considered part of critical infrastructure? So I recognize this is not a Space Force only kind of thing to answer, but how are you thinking through the risk factor to commercial and the protection of commercial assets and services, especially as we really move towards the greater reliance on kind of hybrid infrastructure? I read some of the language in the strategy about really aiding commercial actors by identifying risks, providing kind of actionable and timely data to aid risk mitigation. Can you walk us through kind of some of the conversations you've had about with the commercial sector in that space?
Yeah, it's always a great conversation. And for years we have played, even before the Space Force, the Schriever War Game series, and we've invited historically commercial companies to come participate in that. And the discussions always end up right in this space on what is the department, in this case, what is the Space Force going to ask for from the commercial industry? What is the existing language and understanding before conflict? And then usually it leads to some sort of discussion about insurance or indemnification and how do we think about those things. And I think the DoD level strategy goes right after addressing that point. And hey, there are some things now, and there's some things where we may need legislative help if we decide we want to go down that road in sort of the wartime insurance category. But it starts with the conversation on can we clearly articulate what we need and the fact that we need it through the spectrum of conflict, and do we on the Department of Defense side understand sort of the total capability? Are we 100% reliant on commercial, or are we something less than that? Where's our level of comfort? Is it augmentation? And I think in most cases what we're talking about is beyond augmentation. I think that's the sort of the legacy way of thinking about this. It is, nope, this is interoperable, integrated operations, which increases our reliance on it. And then I think it's just an honest discussion with the company on, as you're setting up these contract vehicles, and there's certainly, there's much to learn here, but as we set up these vehicles and have the discussion on, here's what we're going to ask you to do, what does that look like to you? What does that look like in a conflict? What's the risk that the company's assuming, and how do we mitigate that risk for them, just as we're trying to mitigate risk for ourselves? I don't know that we've arrived at that end state. I think the discussion has to continue. And I'm fascinated to know what that sounds like to commercial industry.
Super. I'm going to, I guess I kind of had a follow-up on that, but I do really want to pull in some audience questions.
Yeah, it's populating on your screen.
Yeah, it is. Some lengthy questions. I guess just one quick thing. Just can you elaborate on this process for sharing threat information with commercial companies? I think the strategy talks about dissemination of actionable threat data. How are you going to navigate that at different classification levels?
Yeah, I think we've done this in other areas. Certainly, when there's a threat within the United States, for example, we make that public. Maybe we don't reveal how we know about the threat or the specifics of it. I think we've done it in the air domain is the example that comes immediately to mind on how we articulate a threatened area, how we share that information. Probably, maybe the best area for us to learn from is in the cyberspace domain, where companies and the government are, establishing threat sharing agreements, and how we communicate that while protecting, classified material if it is classified. We've done some of that already with the commercial integration cell and those companies that are sitting right there on the ops floor. A lot of that is, not every threat is on the pathway to war. Sometimes it's just an environmental threat. Sometimes it's risk of collision and how we communicate that. And sometimes it's just this interoperability of, especially with the proliferated LEO constellations and sort of that safety of flight, traffic management aspect that just require close coordination, communication, integration. And we've had great success in that area with multiple companies. And so I think we know how to do this in some areas. And then areas where classification is a barrier, we got to tear that down. And we can do that. We can do that in lots of ways by protect and still protect, whatever secrets we need to protect.
Great. Okay, so some really interesting questions coming in here. We have a question here from Doug Lavero. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, Doug. So General Bratton mentioned that you think we're already there on remote sensing, but if you talk to the commercial remote sensing industry, they do not believe what the NRO is doing today truly leverages what they could do. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of dichotomy?
I think, sir, it's great to see you. A hero in the space, in the annals of space. I think I thought the inclusion of TAC SRT, surveillance and reconnaissance targeting, in the strategy, I think there's a lot of discussion on that, and how do we think about that? And that, that's one of those areas where maybe it makes us uncomfortable, but we feel like commercial has a lot to offer. I think that's trying to force us away from, hey, we just want to buy imagery from you and keep taking pictures. I think this goes back to the comfort discussion on how comfortable is the department and in this case the Space Force in our dependency on commercial. And there's a lot of incredible capability across the U.S. government in this area. But there's still a demand signal for more. And so there's a little bit of just the reality of budget and, hey, we can do this cheaper and faster and maybe better from commercial in a lot of ways. Let's push into that more and not just buy product from them, but really partner with them and adjust our procurement strategies based on what they're already able to do. I think that's the step that's not been taken, that commercial is sort of looking, and I think the budget is the indicator on, are these just services contracts where you're going to keep buying stuff, or are you going to ask me to do more? Maybe the Surveillance and Reconnaissance Mission is what pushes us there. I think that some of the work that Space Development Agency is doing for the Space Force as part of the Space Force is really leading us into new areas where we're increasing our reliance on commercial partners to operate systems that traditionally, we would have operated, or to be much more of a shoulder-to-shoulder partner than just, send me some data or send me an image or send me, bandwidth, whatever it was. So I think we're trying to get there. I think there's a couple examples where we're making some headway. There's certainly, to Mr. Lovero's point, there's certainly room to grow here.
Okay, so watch this space.
Yeah.
So we have a question here. We have not had the name identified, but the question is, do current program element funding lines provide the flexibility to acquire more commercial products and services, or will they need to be changed in order to implement the strategy? And we talked a little bit about this in the green room.
It's like, all right, someone from my S8 shop is here. No, I think that's a great question. Right now, we have created a line under SSC for the commercial space shop there that is a separate line. And so the answer to the question is probably no. We can do better. I think we got to be careful always to fall back on the definition of commercial. This isn't about procurement, paying a company to build a spacecraft that we will then fly. That we do that all the time. That is not what the strategy is about. This is really about moving to that integrated. I'm trying not to use the word services because it's more than that as I think about it, but into that integrated operations where no owner-operator of a constellation is going to fly side by side with us, is going to take a percentage of mission away, off the government's shoulders and conduct that mission. I don't think within the program element codes we've figured out how to do that, or even within a program office. And the material leaders out there are thinking about this all the time and really leading us in some ways at Space Systems Command and Space Development Agency. But I don't think the funding structure, we've gotten that sophisticated yet on how to do that. That was kind of a long answer to say, no, I don't think we're doing that yet.
Fantastic. So we've got a question here from Alex C. from Starfish Space, which is a commercial satellite servicing company. Alex asks, what is industry's role or responsibility in U.S. leadership as far as establishing norms of behavior in modern space operations? This question comes from thinking about General Saltzman's theory of competitive endurance and the importance of reducing operational surprise, responsible counter-space campaigning, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've talked to a lot of folks about this. I think industry will lead. They move faster. They have innovative ideas, almost always ahead of government. I think that the discussion of norms of behavior and how do we think about traffic management, how is Department of Commerce looking at that? I mean, there's a lot of ways to kind of get after that problem. I think industry will have a much louder voice in, hey, we fly most of the spacecraft on orbit. We're developing all these new capabilities that the customer base expects. We can't restrict that innovation with rules that only work for the Department of Defense. And so there's certainly a partnership there, and we see that in sort of spectrum management now, and there's natural tension that occurs there. I think the norms of behavior space, as commercial industry really moves out into, right now, what's happening, what we see in low Earth orbit, but moves out beyond that, and human spaceflight and all the places are going, not just for Department of Defense, but civil space with NASA, and how do we think about specifically human spaceflight and rules and regulations associated with that. I think what we see is the government trying to reduce the bureaucracy and the red tape and allow commercial. I think there's some examples where the government's done well. I think that we can always do better, but I think the more commercial leads in, here's the rules, industry consortiums and those sort of things, as they start to put forward, here's how we think this should work. I think that's better. I think there's great strength when many companies come together. I don't know if I've talked a little to a couple companies on, hey, how can I help with that? Really, mainly I'm focused on standardization and things like standardized buses and plug and play payloads and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of areas where I think industry can come together. And maybe the government's role is just to provide the venue or the forum or the consortium where industry then comes together and solves the problem for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so one thing we've not really talked about yet is the international allies piece. Yeah. So we are the Atlantic Council. I do have to talk about our allies. And the strategy talks about integrating allies' space systems into this hybrid space architecture. How do you plan on doing that? Are there priority mission areas that you're already discussing, like with allied space commands or their air and space forces? And I guess, it's a similar but a different challenge with commercial. Like, what are the primary barriers or challenges that really exist to integrating with allies?
Yeah, we talk about this a lot, and I think later on, Colonel Benson's going to be around, and he really owns this problem right now. But we think about it in terms of our force design, which is the process we use to determine the capabilities that we need in time of conflict. And we know that, within the Space Force, we don't have all the resources to buy all the things that we wish we had. And so Allies and Partners is another place, commercial being one big player, but Allies is another space that we work in. We've had just recently great meetings, these reoccurring forums, but we really talked about, and I think Honorable Plum's, the declassification work helps in this space as well on, hey, let's talk more about the capabilities and where we are spending our money for the Space Force, and have the allies, if they're willing, have that same discussion back to us, and then really, just like we talked about with commercial, where's that percentage, or where's that comfortable space where, well, okay, if one of the partner nations is investing in space domain awareness, for example, the proof is in the budget. I do not invest in space domain awareness, and I use those dollars, that precious resource in another area of need, and I'm going to now rely on my partner nation to do that. And there's certainly partners we're very comfortable. I think they're eager to hear from us, just as we're eager to hear from them on, well, where are you? Where are you investing and not investing? I think Colonel Benson's going to figure all that out for me in our force design process, and then the mechanism that we use to have that conversation with our allies, which, by the way, that force design process should be the same discussion we have and the same sort of, slide deck that we use with allies is what we use with commercial. And here's where we're investing. Here's where we plan to invest in your company to deliver that capability. And we're not going to buy or build in that case. And so, yeah, we're working hard on that process. General Saltzman's been pretty demanding of the team that I get to lead. Hey, you have to deliver this for me. And so we're close. We have the capabilities, and I think you see some reflections of that in the document. It's really down to the sort of budget detail level and trades that we're willing to make there.
Right. It always comes down to budget.
That's right. That's right.
So we have a question here from Mike Sinclair, who's actually a non-resident senior fellow with us in Forward Defense. So hi, Mike. Mike asks, or he says, the U.S. commercial space industry is a key advantage that the U.S. enjoys over its strategic rivals. Yet this industry is a bit different than traditional aerospace primes, which tend to be big and established. Given the startup nature of many U.S. commercial space entities, how are you ensuring sufficient cyber resilience of the capabilities the Space Force is going to rely on provided by our commercial space partners?
Yeah, I think that, support in cyber from commercial is one of the areas, in the mission areas that we described. But I think specifically to it all goes to the risk assessment of what burden are we going to lay on the company to ensure the cyber protection that makes the government more comfortable. But at the same time, we recognize as we lay burden on there, that slows things down and makes things more expensive, and at the same time it buys down risk. So it's finding that, and it's a discussion we have to articulate the risk that the government's willing to accept, and sort of the trade-off as we work with each of the companies on, are we willing to go faster to have less cyber resiliency? Are willing to accept risk in testing of a new capability in order to get it faster? And these are the same decisions we make on government procured systems. And so I think it's just that same discussion and understanding the burden on the commercial company, and being very upfront about all that, capturing our expectations in the language, but also the commercial company reflecting back on, hey, I can deliver that, but realize, government, if you ask me to do this, here's the consequences to schedule or budget, wherever they come in. And so I think it's that free-flowing discussion that happens in the cyber area, cyber resiliency specifically, or any other area. Yeah.
So we have another question here, again, from Anonymous, that some of what we talked a little bit about in the green room is, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about the Atlanta Council, is there's tons of great stuff out there in the commercial sector, how adopting those innovations more quickly from the government side is really difficult. Part of that challenge is actually knowing what on earth is out there.
Yeah.
So this question gets at that, which is, how can the private sector provide information on its capabilities to inform Space Force designs and architectures? Like, what are the fora? What are the mechanisms?
It's today the acquisition organizations, SSC in particular comes to mind, are really trying to, through their front door program or through industry days, reverse industry days, have this discussion. I think I'll talk a little more on the Futures Command. We've really identified in our sort of force design process the need to look a little further down the road, especially, and Secretary Kendall's really been driving us on, look at emerging technologies and try and understand early how we can leverage a new technology. But we put side by side with technology, we put new concepts, and cislunar or space refueling are great concepts to talk about on. We think there's value there. And Futures Command will look at that in the Concepts and Technology Center. What sometimes we haven't done a great job of understanding on the government side, and in my time in the Space Force, is what's the military utility associated with, in this case, space refueling or cislunar. We think there's benefit there, but we really have to sort of derive the specific military utility case. Before that, demonstrations and S&T dollars to flesh it out, that makes tons of sense to me. But as you move into, we're going to bring this capability into our force design process as part of the the kit we need to fight a war. We really have to wring that out, maybe better than we have in the past. And so, again, I'll go back to the refueling example. Does refueling make me more competitive in peacetime? Does it give me an advantage in wartime? Where's the sort of, we would use wargaming to determine that a lot of times, but where's the evidence that shows the difference that refueling makes in those specific scenarios? And once we understand that, hey, yes, there is military utility here, and here's how we would measure that, then we can go to someone like the Warfighting Analysis Center, Space Warfighting Analysis Center, and start to talk about architectures and space vehicles and different ways to implement that capability. I think industry can help us in each of those steps. Absolutely, I think industry will know in almost always before government, or academia will know, the technologies piece and what's on the horizon that we should really have our eyes on. I think the concepts come from all comers. There's certainly a lot of innovation out in industry where they're bringing new concepts that we hadn't thought of. I think we have the responsibility to sort of wring that out with military utility, not in a room by ourselves, but with commercial partners who are standing there helping us understand the technology and how it might be used. But we really got to, and I think IO and Colonel Benson knows our bosses, the answer on that question, because then comes the decision, are we going to invest in this or not? We've probably spent demonstration and S&T dollars, but a procurement decision where now, Frank Covelli's in the mix, and we're really talking about spending some money on this. Or we're talking about going to a commercial company and having them provide the capability. We got to be able to answer that question. And that's, I think in the discussion with commercial, when I have a lot of meetings with companies. There's a lot of great ideas out there. I don't always see the military utility, not because it's not there, but I just, I need to take that and sort of wring it out in some sort of venue. I think sometimes companies come in and they've already kind of sussed out, here's what we think the military utility is, and here's sort of not just the idea of it, but the evidence behind that is really helpful on the government side when we see that. But I'm not expecting everyone to bring that. I think sometimes we need to, partner up and go figure that out together. And so that's how we're sort of working that in. I think the Futures Command guys, that is their charter, sort of, hey, we have a new idea. Does the idea have military utility? What does it take to implement the idea? That's really the charter of the new organization we're creating.
Yeah, and it's a very iterative process, right?
That's right.
I think, that this reverse industry days and industry days make a lot of sense, right? Because commercial don't necessarily know what you in government need. You don't really know what's out there in commercial, so this kind of cyclical, kind of back and forth, iterative process.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the other struggles on the back end of that is when is something obsolete and we should stop doing it?
Yeah.
And does the new capability replace an old capability? Because we tend to just keep hanging on to all the old stuff and add new stuff in. That's a little bit the budget side of my brain, talking like, I wish I could offload some of this old stuff and someone would help me, work through that problem set as well. But that's a challenge.
Yeah, no kidding. Can't do it all. Fantastic. So, okay, a strategy is only as good as its implementation. So what do you think, kind of a two-part question, what do you think are the biggest challenges or issues to navigate to implement this strategy, put it into action? So that's one. And then what, looking ahead, maybe 2 years from now, maybe 3, 4, 5 years from now, would be an example of successful implementation of this strategy? Like, what would you hope to see in that time frame? What would good look like coming out of this strategy?
Yeah, I think, again, back to why we wrote it, is so we can measure these things and hold ourselves accountable to the words in there. I think that's a challenge. And strategies, sometimes they make splash when you publish them, and then they sit on a shelf and get dusty, and no one goes back to them. I think we are thinking about, and we actually have some planning against metrics of how do we measure both the implementation of it and then over time. I think, I go right back. The proof is in where are we spending our money. If we see across the mission areas identified in the strategy, increased percentage, not just for procurement of hardware from commercial, but procurement of services, increase, transition of mission in some ways to commercial. I think that's a crystal clear metric that we'll be able to measure. I think the reality it probably becomes somewhere in the middle, where there will be some cases where, the commercial industry's got all the SDA and we're just receivers of the data and we're partnered up on that and sharing back and forth. I think I can point to that and say, maybe I'm not buying telescopes anymore because great companies are out there taking care of that business. I think the other ones, what does that look like in precision navigation and timing, and how do we think about that with our sort of obligation, the Space Force obligation within the Department of Defense, but the obligation to provide that signal, to the world for free. I think that's a tougher one to measure, how we benefit. I think there's a great discussion on how GPS has spawned billions of dollars worth of industry and commercial partnership that is a partnership in a different use of the word than what we've been talking about in the commercial strategy, but is still something that government has done and companies have then just taken and done incredible things that we never would have thought of. But back to, the point of it is metrics are important. I think the ultimate metric is where are we spending our money, and that's really, if we can measure the change in what's been allocated, within a program office or within an acquisition organization today, and we come back in 3 years and we measure, all right, how much of the budget now is going for increasing commercial services or commercial operations like we see at Space Development Agency. I think that would be a great way to do that. And then we got to go out to the industry and get some feedback, like is this working for you guys? What feedback, what's the metric on the industry side? Is it just, how is that measured? And did they feel that this has been a successful partnership? Because if we think it's great and the industry doesn't think so, then, that's not healthy.
Yeah.
That's probably not success.
Thank you. So in our final couple of minutes, I did want to give you the opportunity to share any kind of concluding thoughts, any things we didn't touch on that you want to make sure that are really lands with our audience.
Yeah, well, I think, one, thanks again for letting me come out here. It's great to come here for the first time, but hopefully I'll get to come back and see you again. Love the discussion. I think we're eager to get feedback and on the specifics, though, of, hey, this is what's working and this not. And I've been in a couple of just very great forums where commercial industry is kind of taking the gloves off, and it's a little bit, you got to have a thick skin and take the punches when they say, look, you guys got to stop doing this. It's stifling all the things you talk about. This is the barrier, and so that's really helpful when commercial companies, in addition to advocating for their company, and I understand the need to do that, also gives us feedback on, hey, it'd be helpful is this, or and not just helpful for my company, but for the group. And I think those, areas where companies have come together and sort of, and I see this sometimes at Schriever War Game, where they're sort of in a more protected environment, and they freely are discussing amongst themselves, and then they sort of not gang up on government, but together articulate to government, hey, here's what's really helpful. Here's what you need to do, and here's what you're quite frankly messing up. That is, we take that seriously. That voice is very loud when it's amplified, that way by many voices, and so I think the opportunity to create those forums, and this is certainly one of those venues, and to hear from groups of companies is super helpful to us. And so if there's a mechanism I can help to create those environments, I think I'd love to be helpful to industry to do that. I think finally then, we got to hold ourselves accountable, and when you see us deviating from the words we wrote, please call us out on it and say, hey, you asked for change, I'm trying to deliver change, but you're not willing to accept it. There will be uncomfortable moments on the government side, and how we think about risk, especially in a transition to conflict. That's a really important thing for us to be able to articulate and convey, and for commercial companies to understand, because that is, at the end of the day, where the rubber meets the road for the Department of Defense, for the Space Force. We have, and we take very seriously these obligations we have to provide space services to the Joint Force, to protect our assets on orbit, and when called upon, deny that to our adversaries. That's why the Space Force exists. And so, that's sort of sacred ground, but I think we're realizing we can do that we can do that job better with commercial partners. We can do that job better with further integration of our allies, and we have to just keep moving down that road. But speak up, be a loud voice. Would love to hear from anybody. Yeah.
Well, congratulations again, because I think for putting forward a vision for really driving towards integrating with the commercial sector, it's a hard thing to do, and a credit to all those involved in writing the document, and to you for kind of articulating this, and kudos for welcoming feedback. From our side at the Atlanta Council, our commitment is to continue to have convenings like this, and both public and private, where we can help get some of that feedback. You've heard it here first, commercial sector partners, bring your feedback forward. Be frank, and I think dialogue like this really helps further shared kind of understanding and alignment. So thank you so much, General Bratton, for joining us and articulating this really really tremendous and inaugural commercial strategy. Thank you to our audience for being here, and looking forward to staying in touch.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.